when Jeff Henning, who is now at Columbia, but then when he wrote this book in the 1980s, was at George Washington University, he wrote a book about gentrification in Mount Pleasant. And hard as it is to understand now, he had to spend the first part of that book justifying the term gentrification. Because the assumption, which he had to argue against, is that cities cannot renew themselves. There had been a 20, 30-year history of urban decline, and he was coming along and saying, look at this neighborhood in Washington. Home ownership is up, housing prices are up. Something vaguely positive is taking place. And he spent about, was it, first 40, 50 pages of the book saying, this isn't just an outlier. There's this term out there, it even has a term, there's this term gentrification. We have to think about what happens if cities don't only deteriorate. This wasn't that long ago. And I think this goes back to the Borges point that cities change so quickly, we don't understand what's going on. And when you take a look at the numbers we've just heard from Audrey, you really get a sense of how rapidly this city is changing. And I had a direct personal experience of this summer. You know, 4 years ago, I published a book about U Street, and most of the research on that would have been done, I don't know, 5, 6 years ago. And when people come to town, they ask me to show them around U Street. And there were a group of Russian students who came and they wanted to have the tour. And I had the usual tour. I usually start in front of the Howard Theater, and I talk about the importance of 7th Street and of class as well as race, and LaDroit Park and the role of Howard. And I go by the 12th Street Y, and I point out Ben's. Everybody knows Ben's. And I end up at the corner of 14th and U, and I talk about the Reeves Center. And I was telling the story about how the Reeves Center really was a catalytic moment in the return of 14th Street, and how people will debate Barry and Barry's tenure for as long as people think about DC politics. He was responsible for this building, and this building was really important because it was, that corner was a symbolic center of African American Washington. It was destroyed in 1968, and its revitalization was absolutely essential to any understanding that DC had a future. And Barry built that building there because no one else was going to build there, so the city built there. And I happened to be going through this story the week when they announced the land swap to build the soccer stadium in Southwest, and the price the city would pay for that is giving up this incredibly valuable piece of land to a developer. And that would have been unimaginable 20 years ago, 10 years ago. And it shows how quickly the city is changing. So these changes obviously have a great emotional impact. I think anybody who's lived in this city for more than 5 years finds himself or herself walking down a street wondering, when on earth did this happen? And those emotions, that question goes to the core of who we think we are, where we think we live. So what we wanted to do was to talk about gentrification, but to step back and first talk about the processes, talk about how whatever these trends are changing politics and culture, as a way of trying to get a baseline for further discussion. Because I think it turns out that maybe what we think we know, we don't know. And I had that sense this morning. I read all the articles in the Washington Post, which projects a very particular kind of vision about what's happening in this city. And part of that vision, I think many of us in the room have heard, 1,000 new residents are moving into DC every month. These residents tend to be young white professionals. They're investing in the city. And yet this morning we heard 1/3 of new residents in DC for the past several years have been African immigrants. They don't quite fit the profile of gentrifiers. So we wanted to first talk about what is happening, or what we think is happening, and then talk about some of the implications of it, and then open it up. And we have three fabulous speakers to do this. You have their bios, but I'll just say that Sabiyha Price wrote the book on this, literally. African Americans and Gentrification in Washington, D.C. Great book. You should all have a look at it, and I see, maybe we'll get her to hold it up.
A little marketing.
I'm going to read from it.
We'll have a little marketing. Now, Derek Hyra is about to have a book. He can't hold it up yet, but it's on gentrification of Shaw. And Derek is now in a really interesting new position at American University, so you'll be hearing a lot about Derek in the future. And Natalie Hopkinson, I don't know how people in life get research projects like GoGo. This is what I always wanted to figure out. I once had a colleague who was paid by Centauri Liquor to evaluate the drinking habits in bars in London, Tokyo, and New York. I don't know where these grants are. I don't know where you get paid to study GoGo, but maybe we'll find that out as well. So with that, the floor is yours.
Okay, wonderful. Good afternoon, everyone. I really want to begin by thanking, I guess folks that really are not in here, Dr. Blair, Ruble and his team, and Ariana and her team, and a lot of folks responsible for hosting us and organizing this. Can you guys hear me okay? Again, I'm a little chilly, so my voice may, it's a little cold in here. Basically, my contribution to this conversation emerges out of what I did to gather data for this book. Oral histories, reading secondary sources, interviewing a lot of folks, and doing ethnographic research to write this book, African Americans and Gentrification in Washington, D.C. So basically, I'm going to revisit some of these data for today, and I'm also going to add in some of my observations as a native-born Washingtonian. I'm from North Michigan Park in Northeast. I came of age in a white flight neighborhood, and I attended predominantly African-American schools up until the time I went off to college. So our panel is entitled Chocolate City No More, and of course that's a label that certainly merits us entertaining what this concept of Chocolate City means. What does it mean to people? How does it resonate, et cetera. And going into my project, this was a question that I also had. I was very clear about not wanting to taint people's views with my own view, so I kind of came in asking folks really general questions like, have you heard of this concept, Chocolate City? What does it mean to you? In what context have you heard it? Sort of, et cetera. And as you would imagine, Parliament Funkadelic was usually the first thing that came up. Everybody, these people I talk to know about the song, Chocolate City. And let me step back a little bit and just fill you in on some of the details and some of the background information about my book. The content of the book focuses on Black folks that were born in the United States and who live in different parts of D.C. It was not a neighborhood study, so folks lived all over the place. They were 45 years of age or older. Most of the data that I collected go back to 2010, 11, and 12, although the oral histories may have been collected earlier. 8 to 10 of the approximately 100 people the book is based on reside now in Maryland, outside of D.C. Actually, few of them are actually in New York and Philadelphia, but the majority of them are in Maryland. I collected oral histories on a number of elders, most of whom have since passed away since I started gathering the data. Among some of the folks I talked to was a man named Samuel Hollowell, a native Washingtonian and avid biker during the 70s and the 80s, and he described for me some of his friends' experiences riding around town in D.C., pre-bike lane, I should add. And his mom is from D.C., and his dad was born in the Caribbean. And he says to me, I thought of it as our city. It belonged to us, even though they belonged in the real ritzy part. White people were just Georgetown and Connecticut Avenue. Certainly as a teenager and driving, actual contact with whites accentuated the idea that this was our city because clearly they had their part, and when we went to their part, we were suspect. We knew that we were somewhat out of place. I had a sense that they had their own little section, but it was our city. Marcus Jackson is another native of Northeast, and he said, growing up in D.C., Black, in the 60s and the 70s, provided a highly treasured experience. I had little contact with wealthy people and mostly knew working poor people like my immediate family. Mostly these people were Black. This empowers my worldview and racial identity. I was in the 6th grade when I heard Dick Gregory on a live WHUR broadcast from Crampton Auditorium talking about how Black children were taught to dream for whiteness as a measure of success. At age 11 or 12, the talk made me, for the first time, see my dark brown mother as a very beautiful woman. This funny man opened my eyes to the lovely world I discovered home in Northeast D.C. Another person was Bernadette Thompson. She was actually born in Ohio. She arrived in D.C. from another chocolate city. You may hear me say CC sometime for chocolate city. She came from Detroit. She arrived in the 1980s, and she came here to attend Howard University to get a PhD in psychology. She initially lived with her cousin, Asha Michelle, who was also from Ohio, but lived in Adams Morgan after arriving as a teenager. And Thompson says, so, it's Chocolate City. There's always something to do. It was the mecca of entertainment. You know, there was always somewhere to go. You know, the atmosphere seemed to be more cohesive in terms of Black people and everything. And it was like an integration of all these people from all over the planet, Kilimanjaro. You know, all these different places where people would hang out from different ethnicities from the diaspora. And she's giving a shout out there to the Kilimanjaro Club. If anybody remembers, yeah, you're my age. We did a lot of partying, yeah, at the Kilimanjaro, which has since closed down. My final example is Nkechi Omalade. She's another native. She described D.C. as 99% Black. And she wasn't the only person I talked to who used these inflated numbers to describe the percentage of African Americans at its height. Back in July, I spoke at the Lamont Street Collective, and I met a Black gentleman who corrected me when I used 1970 census data to describe how many Black folks were in D.C. when it reached its height. He said he'd been doing his own research and that the number was much higher than 71%. And granted, census data are not always accurate. I have to say that I, too, as a native, was guilty of the same thing, attending Marist College back in the day and telling people that D.C. was upwards of 85% Black. So, a little more about some of these folks that I've just referred to here. These are people who are in their late 50s or early 60s. They came of age during the 60s and the 70s. I'm a member of this same cohort. Our parents grew up during the Depression. We remember segregation, although not in the same way that our parents do. We were affected by the Civil Rights Movement. However, the folks older than us, folks who are now, you know, in their 60s and 70s, are the people who were much more involved in that movement than we were. This is largely a pre-gentrification grouping, if you will. There was one individual that I spoke to. He grew up in Georgetown, and Georgetown experienced gentrification and Black out-migration a lot earlier. These are individuals who are largely, with the exception of the one person who grew up in Georgetown, working class, lower middle class kind of folks. Hallowell, the biker I referred to earlier, his mom was a teacher, his dad was a police officer. Nkechi Omalade, she said that she grew up very low income. Her parents were not college educated. Bernadette Thompson grew up middle class in Ohio, while her cousin, Asha Michelle, described herself as growing up in a working class and background, household, I should say. Michelle spent her teen years in Adams Morgan during the 70s, which was a very lively, ethnically diverse community that lost a number of its Latino residents to Prince George's County. And in terms of my own background, my mom was a public school teacher. My dad was a postal clerk who did not attend college. Asha Michelle and Nkechi Omalade were both married to West African men at one point. Some of these folks were educated at Howard University. which you guys know is a historically black institution, and through that they have a lot of contact with folks from the Caribbean and from Africa. And finally, I'll also add that back in the 80s, when these folks were in their late 20s and 30s, the anti-apartheid activity was very common. It constituted a very visible and prominent movement in D.C., and it drew participation from diasporic populations. So in other words, Pan-Africanism has been an important, I understand, understudied phenomenon in D.C., at least in anthropological literature. And it's an element of black life it's very important here. It impacts political life, it impacts the arts, religious life, the use of public space, as well as local media. And here I'm actually thinking about WPFW, the Pacifica Network, which has really been a conduit for building diasporic connections and, you know, international connections more broadly, both here and in the DMV. So what I'm doing here, you know, with this kind of background details, and I won't give you any more listings, I'm painting a picture that I'm trying to complicate the view of who and what U.S.-born African Americans in D.C. are by including these layers of generation, of neighborhood, of socioeconomic status, place of origin, who are in their social networks, the content of social networks. And in my book, I actually also use sexuality as an aspect of African American diversity. And here, I'm also exploring how the idea of D.C. as a chocolate city emerges as something that's, you know, meaningful among people that I spoke with. And what I heard in engaging folks on this issue implied notions of being wrapped in a cocoon of blackness, if you will. Themes of belonging, I heard, being protected were conveyed. Notions of having your identity reinforced, as Marcus Jackson said about the impact of Dick Gregory. And I don't want to overstate matters here. You still have the ramifications of class inequality, and certainly growing up, you know, very keenly aware of that. Upper 16th Street, the Gold Coast, was associated with upper class folks. Going out to the suburbs and seeing folks living in big homes. I was also very aware of colorism too, growing up. So it's also the case that this notion of a chocolate city is no sort of panacea for class inequality and people who grew up in low-income households. So I wouldn't want to overlook these factors. I think the larger takeaway here is that the existence of a chocolate city can insulate you from some of the harsher ramifications of racism that I learned about leaving D.C. and interacting with folks who came from different sorts of environments where they weren't majority black. I also talked to people who linked this idea of a chocolate city to having African American political representation and hence a voice for the community to advocate for resources, for rights, for opportunities with. And even within this more politicized sort of view, you still hear references to belonging, to having a sense of well-being, to having a place, to having visibility, to having a voice. So given the positive aspects of what my research reveals about the idea of a chocolate city, if gentrification challenges these demographics, then a part of what gentrification threatens could be black folks' sense of belonging and perhaps their sense of political representation. In my research, I recorded stories of alienation, of new neighbors who would not speak to their African American neighbors, new neighbors who would call the police on their African American neighbors for very minor conflicts, which of course become escalated when you get the police involved. And on the political front, also connected to the fact that gentrification is a policy-driven process. And I don't want to wax too nostalgically here, but there have been political leaders, as was just laid out, that we've had in the history of the city that have put forth legislation designed to protect residents or mitigate the impact of overdevelopment, of uneven development, and urban dislocation. And here I'm thinking about folks like Hilda Mason and Dave Clark. So the idea of a chocolate city and how African American residents view it, I think really provides us with an avenue for thinking about what gentrification threatens and or what stands to be lost through gentrification. And secondly, and to conclude, here's another thing to think about that's more specific to the Black Mosaic concept. In addition to leaving you all with an additional framework for looking at DC's African American population, I also want to share what that I witnessed ways in which gentrification kind of cuts across the diasporic differences. Asha Michelle, I'd mentioned her before, working class from Ohio, born and raised in Adams Morgan. Her ex-husband is a native of Guinea, West Africa. And his business, for all intents and purposes, was driven out of D.C. after being labeled by gentrifiers as attracting the, quote, wrong kind of people to the 14th Street corridor. His business was a restaurant and a nightclub, and it's now located in PG County. And another example concerns the Islander restaurant. Perhaps some of you have had those delicious roadies there. I believe it's Trinidadian owned, and it's been at that location at 12th and U Street for at least over a decade. It's a very busy intersection if you're familiar with it. And through a U.S.-born African-American companion to the owner, I learned that the restaurant is currently in a conflict with, again, new neighbors who've complained about the noise and the clientele. The clientele consists of middle-aged, U.S.-born and Caribbean-born Black rabble-rousers, very dangerous people. So, you know, just concluding then, these are developments, I think, that bring together gentrification, issues of demographic change, the idea of a CC, a chocolate city, and the Black Mosaic, I think, together in ways that have considerable implications for the future of the city. And I'll conclude there. Thank you.
Thank you. I have one footnote, and then I want to ask a question, then we'll go to Derek, who will take us into the political ramifications. But my footnote is, any graduate students here, there is a really interesting study to be written about the intellectual impact of Pan-Africanism on DC thought. And it goes way back. One of the most remarkable generations in this city are the people who were born around the turn of the 20th century. And we all know Duke Ellington, but Carter Woodson. There's a whole list of people who came out of the city, many of whom went off in World War I and were in Europe. And several of them, Rayford Logan for sure, and there are a couple other people I've encountered in their biographies, when they were demobilized in Europe, kind of hung out, because why wouldn't you hang out in Paris? And as a result, they had opportunities to attend the first and second Pan-African Congresses. And that thought came back into DC, largely through Howard, but also through the intellectual elite, Dunbar High, and so on. And there's really a wonderful intellectual history to be written about. It comes up again in the 60s, but the point is it didn't just suddenly appear in the 60s. It really has very deep roots in DC. It shapes how people here thought about their place in the world. And I think I wanted to underscore that. I wanted to just, one of the quotes you just made really kind of goes to the heart of the gentrification conundrum for me. This isn't exactly right, but one of the first ones you wrote said, you know, there was our city and their section. And I think the debate now about gentrification is what's following. Is it Mayor Gray's one city, or is it their city, our section? And I think this captures a lot of the misgivings. And I'm wondering, given all the work you've done, do you have a sense of where this is going?
The divisions? Well, I mean, at this point, we have the power to be able to alter where it goes, to be able to alter the future. But if we keep going on this trajectory, I would say we're not headed in a good direction, because we haven't done the work. You know, I was interviewed at WAMU, and one of the questions I was asked was, is gentrification good or bad? And as we begin to talk more, and as I begin to share that you cannot take gentrification out of the context of racial and class inequality within this city. So you put it within that context, and those are two bad things. I think we can all agree on that. So if gentrification flows out of that, then gentrification is going to be very problematic. And so what he concluded was, we're asking the wrong questions. We should be asking, what else can we do besides gentrification, or why gentrification? Why not other? Why not equitable development? So I think we're headed in a direction that more people are going to be displaced, probably, and you're going to have more, a wider gap between the haves and the have-nots, and then you have the social and the interpersonal ramifications of that, which are very layered. I would be very keen. My focus of my book is social justice, so I do look at conflict, but that's not the whole story. There's also stories of people cooperating. There's stories of people living in multiracial neighborhoods for actually decades. And so one very pivotal interview I did took place in 16th Street Heights. Folks who live in gigantic, beautiful homes, predominantly African-American, but had been mixed racially for quite a while. So one woman I interviewed, she pointed out a gay man that she sits on his porch and drinks mint juleps, interracial couple here, a white friend here, just, majority African-American. People got along fairly well, but I have to say, when newcomers, whites, come in, because again, these houses are upwards of 900,000, so when someone passes away, the people who buy the homes tend to be white, right? So that's another way, wealth inequality, how that happens, right? Also conflict. People come in, they don't respect the rules that were in existence. Here's one example, and then I'm going to stop talking. One newcomer was parking anywhere she wanted to park on the block, and the woman I interviewed was a block captain. She said she had to knock on doors and say, we don't do that here because we have elders, and we don't want to block their parking areas. We don't want them to have to walk long distances. Miss so-and-so across the street had a hip replacement, so we don't want to park in front of her house. This is neighborhood. This is community. People know what's going on. The response she got from that person was, this is America. I can park anywhere I want. So I don't think I need to say anything else.
Well, how we shape this process depends on politics, and so it's fitting that Derek is going to be next. But I have to say, I was reminded of your book launch here a few years ago. You're looking at the author of a really fabulous book on gentrification of Bronzeville, Chicago, and Harlem in New York. And at the book launch, he invited a friend of his, a New York State Assemblyman from Harlem, and I should remember the name.
Keith Wright.
Right, Keith Wright. And he just had the experience where new neighbors in his neighborhood in Harlem were complaining about Sunday morning drum circles. And his response was, well, why did you move to Harlem? I mean, so there's, I can't help but not repeat that story, given what you just said. It's all yours.
All right. Well, let me again thank Ariana and Blair for hosting us here, and it's a privilege to be on this panel to talk a little bit about some of my work on gentrification in Washington, D.C. And I think Sabiyha did a great job of sort of helping us understand what the idea of Chocolate City meant to some people in the past here. But I'm going to argue, just like the title says, that the Chocolate City as we knew it does not exist anymore. And actually what I'm going to argue is this city can be known more for this idea of the Cappuccino City as opposed to the Chocolate City, and I'm going to unpack that in the talk. But my talk will center on the idea of Chocolate City and the loss of that, but looking at the idea of the political side of what Chocolate City meant, right? We got home rule, Walter Washington and Marion Barry. I mean, this is black empowerment coming out of the civil rights movement and being and taking the power of the nation's capital. And that sort of political movement with the demographic shifts that have happened in the city is on the demise. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that. But let's talk about some of the demographic shifts that have happened. And Audrey did a great job of talking, and I see her over there, about the demographic shifts here. But a lot of what she talked about was at the metropolitan level. Let's talk a little bit about the actual demographic shifts in Washington, D.C. So between 2000 and 2010, D.C. lost almost 50,000 black folk, right, moved out of the city, and gained about 50,000 mainly white young professionals moving into the city. So, we're talking about immigration patterns and population movements, but one of the startling things is that there is this back to the city movement that happened here, and we had a 5.2% population gain in Washington, D.C. from 2000 to 2010, and that population movement is changing the political norms and structure of Washington, D.C. It is also related to the gentrification. Most of the population that's coming back is coming back to the downtown core. That's where the jobs are, and you're seeing the downtown expand. So you're seeing Penn Quarter, Chinatown, Shaw, Columbia Heights, and whatnot. So we're seeing expansion of the central business district, and we're seeing a gentrification overdrive happening in low and moderate income black neighborhoods that are just on the periphery of the downtown. So again, with this influx of whites to DC, Chocolate City can be better characterized as Cappuccino City. Now, some of you will argue with me on this, but a cappuccino is nothing but a flipped coffee with a little bit of milk. And what I mean by that is you got the pressed ground beans, right? You run some boiling water through it, you add the steamed milk, and you get a mixed color, more expensive drink, the cappuccino. Now at Starbucks, the coffee is $2. The cappuccino is $5, right? And the milk is the millennials. The millennials are coming in, and then the properties with a little bit of rehab in DC are going from $200,000 to $500,000. If you don't have $500,000, you're not going to be able to live in this city. So that's what's happening here. Now, I'm all for the redevelopment of the low and moderate income neighborhoods, but I want, as Sabiyha just talked about, equitable development. I want development that benefits the long-term, low and moderate income African-American residents, but also the newcomers. But in my 5 years of research, in ethnographic research of the Shaw U Street neighborhood, I've seen relatively little benefit to low and moderate income people. And actually, they're losing their political power. Now, before I get too negative, let me just say that DC does have some of the best laws in the country to allowing people to stay in place when a neighborhood gentrifies. I've studied New York and Chicago, but DC has the right of first refusal. They also have homestead senior property tax deductions. There is a property assessment cap credit, and these policies have been critical to having low and moderate income people actually stay in their neighborhood. But these laws do nothing to prevent political displacement. So what I mean by political displacement is when long-term residents lose the power to control the decisions that affect their neighborhoods. So in the Shaw U Street area, the demographics went from, in 1970, 90% black, to now the population is only 30% black in 2010. Now in the 90s, the Shaw U Street area went through multiracial gentrification. You had an influx of actually whites, blacks, Hispanics, Latinos, who were all upper income. But in the 2000s, the new population that's been coming in has been young white professionals. Now the newcomers, the black, white, and Hispanics, they are taking over the ANCs. They are also taking over the formal political structure in terms of the representation at city council. And the neighborhood civic associations are also changing from the old-timers to the newcomers. So here's a quote from Giovanni, a newcomer to the Shaw U Street area. He says, and he's one of the new presidents of the Civic Association, "You look at the city that was once historically a black city run by blacks. Now you look at the black population, the projections are that the district will look more like California by the end of 10 years, where there will be more ethnicities and it will be multiracial." So I think that they, black Washingtonians, are like, oh my God, we used to run the city. So the return of the black middle class, this back to the city movement, I mean, this is something that William Julius Wilson, very well-known sociologist, was calling for federal policies in the 1990s. And he stressed that this would deconcentrate poverty. He predicted that the return of middle-income residents to the inner city would actually bolster the political power of these areas and would bring new amenities. However, Wilson did not predict that the new amenities would be dog parks and bike lanes, amenities that don't necessarily reflect the preferences of existing residents. Now, here's a quote from Marshall Brown. He's the father of the former D.C. City Councilmember Kwame Brown. I'll talk a little bit more about him and his troubles. But he states, the new white residents, want doggy parks and bike lanes. The result is a lot of tension. The new people believe more in their dogs than they do in people. This is not the district I knew. There's no relationship with the black community. They don't connect at the church. They don't go to the same cafes. They don't volunteer in the neighborhood school. And a lot of longtime black residents feel threatened. So the tensions that he's talking about are not necessarily because of the amenities per se, but they are because of the political power shifts in the ANCs and the neighborhood groups in the city council and the shift from the old guard to the new guard. So in Shaw, the political landscape has shifted, and this is reflected in Walter Fauntleroy's quote here. Now, Walter Fauntleroy, I'm sure you all know who he is. I mean, he is one of the greatest black political leaders in this city has ever had, and he has fought old urban renewal to maintain Shaw from being leveled in the 60s. And he states, I can't get caught up fighting where the cards are stacked against you. Shaw U Street should be a place where people can all live together. But I gave up, quite frankly. The guard has shifted. So, with the Back to the City movement, power dynamics in the city have changed, as well as the norms of politics. Now, we just witnessed the takedown of a number of black city council members, Michael Brown, Kwame Brown, Harry Thomas, who thought the old norms of political business today were the same as they once were. Clearly, they are not. So, while the D.C. politics of the day may reflect various interests, it is clear that the old black power structure of Chocolate City is in decline. Both demographic and economic shifts have led to the demise of Chocolate City and the rise of the Cappuccino City, where dog parks, wine bars, expensive restaurants are in, black churches, and go-go clubs are out. So, in this city, we need to find a balance where we honor the past and build for the future. We need equitable development and political parity so that DC's old and young, rich and poor, straight and gay perceive that they have the power to influence the trajectories of their communities, and we maintain a true social mosaic. Thank you.
Derek, thank you. You mentioned, you made two references which I want to try to string together in maybe an unexpected way. But you talked about the Back to the City movement, which I think is a factor which was largely unanticipated. And that gets it to Walter Fauntleroy. Walter Fauntleroy and his colleagues with Nico, they saved Shaw to be gentrified. Part of the movement was to develop neighborhood power, to have neighborhood planning, to use that planning to connect a neighborhood like Shaw to employment centers. There would have been no metro in Shaw were it not for Walter Fauntleroy. And then the metro opens up, and it becomes the vehicle for undoing everything that Walter Fauntleroy was trying to achieve, in part because larger societal cultural norms changed. That suddenly, a bunch of people with money who would have chosen to live in the suburbs thought, gee, look at these nice old houses full of character, 15 minutes away from a nice professional job. Why shouldn't I live? To what extent do you see the processes we're describing as primarily local, or to what extent do they tie into a larger discussion about what's happening in American cultural preferences, in American power relations?
Yeah. Well, I think that there was a large push, and I talked about William Jewis Wilson. We had the empowerment zones. We had the Hope 6 legislation that knocked down a lot of the public housing that was distressed. And when we did that, I think we changed the preference patterns of people, and people who may have chosen to go out to the suburbs or other areas of the city now looked to come to these areas that were once low income. But I think there was this myth that we could build these mixed income, mixed race communities and everything would work out just fine, right? But we have this history of segregation. We have income and wealth disparities. And when you put people that have been segregated for so long together, there are conflicts. And really, when you look at the Shaw U Street area, which looks incredibly diverse when you're on 14th Street, when you're on U Street, but when you get into the social fabric of the community, there's a micro-level segregation. And we didn't do anything locally with policy or nationally with policy to anticipate that there would be conflicts. And we didn't prime the pump of local integration within mixed income communities. And I think that that's something that we really need. And there are very few organizations within the Shaw U Street area, but within any of our mixed income communities that are emerging that have really thought through how to bring people together and have meaningful social interaction across race and class. I don't know if that really answered Blair's question, but it came close.
It definitely frames the discussion.
Yeah.
Natalie, go-go. We already had a reference to go-go and pivotal moments such as the Go-Go Club in the Reeves building being shut down as part of really the transformation of what happened in that neighborhood. So I'm looking forward to hearing what you have to say.
Hello, everyone.
Hi.
So who has heard of Go-Go? Who is not familiar with Go-Go? So who is a Go-Go fan? Okay, all right, great. So I'd actually like to just start by playing a little bit of the music. This particular song actually speaks to all of the themes that Eric's talk and Sabiyha's talk and Blair's talk as well. So I'll play a bit of it and then how it tells the story of gentrification.
Welcome to D.C. You know we're down at the USA Cap. You're taking us slightly, I'm taking us slightly. Now how you know I know you gon' be right back. Well, we gon' be right here, we gon' be right here. We ain't going nowhere. Welcome to D.C. D.C., the home of Chuck Brown. Oh, you don't know the sound? Well, let me break it down. The G.O., the D.C. We ain't going nowhere.
Okay, I'm going to stop it there since we're short, but welcome to DC. You know, and at, I think at the last bar, he talks about the new DC is the DMV, and so he's, you know, talking about the disbursement of the chocolate city. So I'm Natalie Hopkinson, and I get that question a lot, Blair, about like who gets to study go-go, who does this, you know, who does their PhD in go-go. And I really consider myself so privileged to be able to do it. I first started writing about it as a writer. I was a writer and editor for the Washington Post and the Root for years. And then I went and I did my PhD at the University of Maryland, College Park, where my dissertation was on go-go music. So I studied it, you know, using ethnomusicology methods. And so it became a book with Duke University Press called Go-Go Live, The Musical Life and Death of a Chocolate City. And I don't have my book here to flash, but you know, available everywhere. Busboys and Poets has been really supportive of the book if you're interested. So it's really a book of essays and photographs that tell how DC became the chocolate city and how it stopped being the chocolate city, and it's all told through this frame of go-go music. And so I'm going to spend my time sort of talking about what go-go is and how it functions in the chocolate city. But you know, it's one of those things, like, I don't think that anybody wonders where you know, the grants are for studying ballet or Mozart or, you know, any of those art forms. And I think that it just sort of speaks to, you know, go-go is really race and classed. And, you know, it's really difficult for people to see people who look like this as doing art. And so this is what I've sort of been pushing up against for my career. And but it's one of these only in the chocolate city sort of cultural forms. So go-go music is a lot of things. First, it's a genre of music, so it's indigenous to DC. So it was born in the mid-1970s, rooted in funk. It's a cousin of hip-hop. And so it's something that really came about as DC was still reeling from the fires of the 1968 riots that followed the assassination of Martin Luther King. So, you know, you had that, but before the riots, you know, you had white flight, you had black middle class flight, you had a city that was really hollowed out, in particular the commercial corridors. So these storefronts were pretty much abandoned, the ones that went up in flames on U Street, 8th Street, and a bunch of other places really were sort of left to die. And that's where Chuck Brown came in. And so Chuck Brown is a blues guitarist. He's, you know, works in a lot of different genres, but he single-handedly actually created the go-go sound at a club in Northeast called the Maverick Room. He was sort of experimenting with different rhythms, and he knew that he had, and I interviewed him in 2010 for my book, and he said that he knew that he was onto something when you know, they were sort of playing around with some of the percussion. Chuck had played with a band called Los Latinos, so he really integrated a lot of Latin rhythms into his music. And he said that the conga player, he knew that he had hit on something when all of a sudden everyone in the room just sort of exploded. People started jumping on tables, you know, and then the next time they came back, he was like, all right, we're gonna come right back to that groove. Next time people came back, they just started like opening up the space so people could just sort of dance. And so it's sort of it's a slowed down, sultry sort of funk that's really special, and everybody copied it, you know. So he spawned a generation of young musicians in DC that picked up the congas, picked up the horn section, picked up all the elements that Chuck Brown created. And so it truly is a black mosaic of black cultural traditions from, you know, West Africa to South America. And so it's sort of a reflection of this call of response between black cultural traditions across the Atlantic Ocean. And it's and it's also, go-go is also a place. So, you know, people say, all right, I'm going to the go-go, so it's the place. And so that place could be a club, it could be a bar, it could be a backyard, a firehouse, it could be school prom, really anywhere, park. So, I'm going to the go-go. So it's sort of a pop-up space, to use the art world term, that becomes transformed by the music and the rituals that accompany the music. And this is really important around the gentrification, many of these spaces were truly abandoned. And so, you hear people talk about the Howard Theater in the 80s before it was shuttered. Go-go bands were playing those last shows where the ceiling was falling in on people while they were jamming. And so, it's sort of like the city's literally falling apart as go-go is sort of filling these spaces. And it's also, go-go is also a network of Black-owned businesses. So we're talking about promoters, musicians, fashion designers, retailers, club owners, and it really is a multi-million-dollar industry. And it mostly off the books, of course. And so for nearly 4 decades now in DC, it's go-go is an experience that you could experience any day of the week. There are multiple venues where you can go experience go-go. And then and this is where my sort of scholarly work came in, it's also like a cultural history and it's a geography. So one of the contributions that I tried to make in my book was just looking at how this music is really a cultural artifact, that it captured people, places, communities, stories that were truly ignored and abandoned by mainstream dominant cultural channels, and sort of, created the sort of shadow city to the larger nation's capital. And so, for instance, and this is just one example, I transcribed a 1986, a key classic 1986 performance, live at Breeze's Metro Club by Rare Essence. And by transcribing that and then heavily footnoting it, I showed how you can literally see the birth of the crack economy years before anyone knew what was going on. But if you went to the go-go, you would know that, because it is what's happening. But at its essence, go-go is a conversation. So, another one of the key, so congas are really key to identifying it as the genre. If you know the congas and that beat, you know that it's go-go, but also call and response is a real integral part of it. And so it's a unique, and so that it's not really captured on this video, but go-go at its essence is a conversation between the band and the audience. So and the audience is part of the band. So they're just throwing out calls, the audience is giving it back. Go-go is not a spectator sport. You must participate. You cannot just sit there and look. It's an interactive experience. And so, between dances, people call out neighborhoods, people, individuals, places, schools, all of these things are being acknowledged within the live go-go experience. And so, what I was trying to do with my research was to take that conversation that's happening within go-go and putting it into conversations with the larger conversation about what's happening in cities all around the country. And, it's really looking at, the movement of economies and labor. So starting from slavery, where DC was a central battleground, to the rise and decline of industry, and of course that's all closely tied to race. So go-go really exists because DC is a chocolate city, and it became the chocolate city because it was a southern slaveholding city, like many southern slaveholding cities, but no other city was home to the Federal Power Center. So, for instance, when Lincoln freed slaves in the District of Columbia within the Diamond limits, 9 months before everywhere else, that really created a flood of Black people coming in. So Constance Green, who's done a lot of wonderful history of DC, she estimated that as many as 40,000 people, and they called them contraband, had flooded into the city, in the years after that Emancipation Proclamation. So by 1865, you had a flood of 40,000 people. So the city really became a refuge for many Blacks. So, as I was loving to hearing Sabiyha's discussion of cocoon of Blackness. And so there's all these institutions that came up, including Howard University, where I went. I also graduated from Howard University as well. So there are all these many institutions that, although it was never utopia or perfect, it really was a refuge for Black people where, because of many of the larger national political currents going on that, sort of played out in Congress, and that directly affected what was going on in the neighborhoods. So today, of course, when this is what we're talking about, there's the new chapter to this story. There's the mass elimination of public housing where generations of Black families have lived. And then there's gentrification pressures pushing out other housing that's not public housing. So even people who own their homes are having a difficult time holding on to them. And so we're seeing a displacement of this population, and again, to echo what Derek and Sabiyha is saying, and very little reckoning with the root causes of the challenges that those communities have faced, why we ended up here, the historical factors, the economic factors that allowed them to be in this sort of vulnerable place where another group can decide that they just want it and they can just sort of take it, and there's like how are they so vulnerable? How is this community so vulnerable? And so how that's played out in DC, and I'll just say this will be the last few things, how the gentrification has played out within go-go is, so many of these, so initially like the place like the Maverick Room, which was at a storefront at 4th and Rhode Island Northeast, many of those places are going upscale, they're being displaced, they're being turned into condos, some of the big venues are being turned into condos. There's still a lot of social pressure. Go-go music is working class Black, so there's, within the Black community, it's not favored by the middle and upper middle class people. That's not the music of choice. It's actually a signal that if you say you don't like go-go, that's a signal that, that's sort of a class identification around that. For instance, one of the hottest bands right now in the city is Black Alley. Any Black Alley fans here? They play on U Street, but they don't call themselves a go-go band, which is, to me, I'm like, they're clearly a go-go band. They call themselves garage funk, because it's very difficult to get gigs if you identify as a go-go band. That is seen as that old stuff, we don't like those people. We don't want those people. We don't want the trouble that accompanies those people, so they're not there. And I gave a talk last year to a group of judges, and one of them came up after my talk and said she lived in Petworth, and she talked about how there was a new music venue that had opened, and it was a condition of the ANC. It was a condition of them supporting their liquor license that they would never play go-go music. So, it's shocking to me. And then, I think the last quick sort of element of change in the city that's really affected go-go is the school system. It's sort of the privatization of public education in the city. The neighborhood school system was pretty key in creating the conditions for allowing go-go music to take root and to have this sort of strong identification with your community, and each neighborhood, or each block even, represented by a go-go band. That hasn't happened. So most of the infrastructure for go-go has moved out into Prince George's County, Maryland, and it is far from dead, but it's dispersed. And go-go music is an urban culture that it's fundamentally, so it's trying out there, but sort of struggling. So go-go isn't dead, but it's fading, dispersed, and it's just a lot of my work was just trying to understand what it means and increase appreciation and awareness about one of the really beautiful things about the chocolate city that was created. So I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
Minds work in very bizarre ways, and as I was looking at this, I was reminded of a YouTube video made by a Russian immigrant kid who grew up in Rockville, and it's a go-go homage to Rockville.
Oh.
And you have to wrap your mind around that. And of course, one part of it is sort of, it sort of gets to what it should be, but call and response really isn't part of it. So it isn't quite there.
Right.
And I think part of what we've been talking about is whatever this new city is becoming, it's not quite there in terms of how we all thought of Washington before. It's something else. Better or worse, that's a different, whether a go-go anthem to Rockville, Maryland is a good thing or a bad thing, we can probably talk about. But it's not quite the same thing. I think that's part of the story. I had one question I want to ask you to, I want to pick up on a comment you made because I think it's been missing in this discussion largely, and maybe you can say a few words about it. You spoke about go-go being a network of Black businesses and entrepreneurs.
Yeah.
Part of what's going on is a change in the place of Black entrepreneurship in the district, I think. And I guess maybe if each of you can relate what you see happening with commercial businesses, then we'll just open it up and we'll start.
Sure. So, and it's not just the Go-Go Club. So, you had Reeve Center, which the Club U was, this is just one of my favorite things about Go-Go was it's like depends on the time of day, like what's happening. So, the Reeve Center is this bureaucratic place where all these boring suit things happen during the day. And at night, Go-Go, the bands would come in and, become Club U. So it just becomes this new place. So, that was possible because of, Marion Barry, as Blair mentioned. But there were a lot of storefronts. So that was a brand new construction, but there were a lot of storefronts that were abandoned, after the riot. So, and so they had not just clubs, but they also had the clothing industry. And so, like, I studied a lot of that about 10 years ago, where, you had, a corollary to the go-go industry was this like sort of urban fashion lines. And so, you would wear the different, like Madness and Hobo and Shooters and all these different, We Are One, many different clothing lines. And depending on what neighborhood you were, you could wear these clothes, and if you wore them to the go-go, it would sort of show what neighborhood that you came from, and sort of like, source of pride. Though a lot of those clothing lines have moved, like, if you drive out onto Route 5, they're there, like they've popped up back over there. But a lot of that was because these storefronts were really cheap. Nobody wanted to be there. And so, it's interesting to me that, now, even as a policy concern, there's interest in using arts as a tool for redeveloping. And, that's really what happened with Go-Go, So they were able to sort of fill these spaces that were pretty much abandoned and unloved, and through, song, dance, creativity, ritual, sort of bring them back to life. And so, like many other artists, communities of artists, as soon as their job is done, they're told to go move on to somewhere else. And so that's sort of what you see happening with a lot of the storefronts. So it's really difficult to get in as a business right now. Like the bar to entry is pretty high. Just like to try to buy a house, it's pretty difficult now. So.
Derek, can you say something about the commercial?
Yeah, I want to make one comment related to Natalie's presentation, and then I'll get to the commercial. But I mean, one of the things is that there was a lot of proliferation of go-go clubs on U Street. And at the time, Frank Smith was the Ward 1 council member, African-American civil rights leader. He was there for 16 years. And he was defeated by Jim Graham, white HIV activist. He's the current Ward 1 council member. When the transition happened from the black to the white city council member, Jim Graham went on a crusade to rid U Street and Club U of go-go. So I wanted to connect. There is this political displacement, which then leads to a cultural displacement. Right. And part of the reason why go-go is out in the suburbs now is because of residential displacement, but also because of the political displacement and the shift, again, from the old guard to the new guard in terms of politics in the city. So they're connected. So, and in terms of black businesses, or just businesses, I mean, one thing I find interesting is that with the redevelopment of the inner city, I mean, there was the old urban renewal, right, which was, in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, and mainly it was to protect white businesses, it was white construction companies, it was white developers, but that necessarily isn't the case today. And when we look at the redevelopment of the Howard Theater and Progression Plaza, I mean, that's Chip Ellis. He's, Black Washingtonian, and he's making millions off the redevelopment. Now, I'm not saying that's a good or a bad thing, but it is something different than what we had in the past. And I've studied Harlem and Bronzeville on the south side of Chicago. And today we have leading black developers who are making substantial amounts off the redevelopment of the low-income black communities. So it's not just race, it's class. And we have to consider both of them when we're trying to unpack and understand the gentrification process that's happening here in Washington and around the country.
I want to give a shout out to Jessica Solomon over there because this summer I attended a very good talk at the Kennedy Center that she moderated, which was about hip hop and the impact of gentrification was, I think, implied in that, affecting hip hop and moving hip hop away from the U Street area as well. In terms of the commercial angle, I think I'll just go back just a little bit to desegregation. I think that was probably some of the early nails in the coffin of African-American owned businesses. And then kind of fast forwarding to the redevelopment angle and the gentrification angle, I think the black businesses are basically, as Derek and Natalie are saying, have followed the displacement of African Americans from the city. So we are seeing a decrease in that. We're seeing black businesses die an unnatural death. I've already laid out 2 instances being relocated to PG County again. You have mom and pop stores that have not been able to hold on. You had a slew of businesses that were actually displaced right off of New York Avenue because we have a Walmart coming, right? So I think that's the wave of the future.
We have about 10, 15 minutes at most. Maybe we'll collect some comments and questions. We need the microphone up front. We got a couple of questions up here. Right there.
Thank you.
I have a question about code enforcement and how it ties in. Because, we've been talking go-go, the effects, and then the Islander and the complaints in terms of music and sort of different cultural expectations around sound and music. And so I'm curious as to how, rules and regulations and code enforcement as a tool, or that the role of code enforcement, or maybe not just that maybe these codes already existed, but that the enforcement of the codes increased over time. So if you could comment a little bit about that.
Okay, and let's take the comment right here.
Nope.
You hear me? Oh.
Yeah, there you go.
Oh, yes. Okay. Mainly my question is to Dr. Hopkinson. My dissertation was about black women who strip for each other in Washington, D.C. So you can imagine that the grants were lining up for me, too. But I was just on the edge of my seat listening to you talk because a lot of the events were in U Street or Southeast, in those big warehouse clubs that I saw in the video, which really aren't there now. And they went to New York Avenue. And now we see what's going on with New York Avenue. So they're now moving out to the suburbs more and more. And so my question to you is really, because I noticed that in the city, a lot of times what happens is when there's a site that's identified as a place where it's a safe place where folks can have these sorts of events, a lot of other events kind of migrate there too. So drag shows will come there, go-go shows will happen there too. And so I'm curious about, I'm finding in my work that there's house parties happening. It's sort of going back to that tradition of, let's just get some people together, we'll get together in the backyard, and it becomes this private event so that you're not dealing with the venue. But also I'm wondering about the role of the internet as far as go-go as well, because I notice in my work too, there's a notion of let's share this information through Facebook and Twitter and things like that so people know where to go. And so I'm just curious if you're seeing that a parallel in terms of go-go. How are artists finding spaces to to get that work done and find a place where people can get together.
Yeah.
Let's see if we can collect a couple more questions right back here, and then.
Hi, thank you all for your presentations. I have a question. I tried to write it. It's not really clear, but I'm wondering, and actually I think all of you could probably address this, in thinking about gentrification and I guess the out-migration of African Americans or folks of the African diaspora. It seems as though Blackness is still being used in some way to develop the area. I'm curious how you guys see, let's say, I mean, with a lot of development along U Street specifically, and the different businesses that have been kind of labeled with names of African American pioneers, political leaders, in a variety of areas, not just U Street, but just the way, and I know Derek can speak to Black branding, but specifically how Blackness really does transform the area politically, economically as well, and culturally, how there's something desirable still about Blackness that's bringing other folks into the area but still displacing Black people themselves.
And over here, and then is there any other question? This will be the last question will come up, and I'll end with the final question.
Yes, thank you so much for the panel. I'm on the D.C. Commission on African American Affairs, and we have a committee on gentrification, and I'd like to invite the three of you to come and talk with the committee. 2 comments in that question. I got the takeout menu for the Chinese restaurant in Silver Spring, and it has chicken with mumbo sauce.
Yes.
So mumbo sauce has moved to the suburb.
Yeah.
When I curated the Folklife Festival program on DC for its bicentennial in 2000, the highlight was when we invited Chuck Brown to come and play on the mall. And when the word went out that Chuck was playing the Smithsonian, my cousin called me. And my cousin is our determination of whether we have reached the community. And my cousin called me and said, Chuck Brown's coming to Smithsonian. I said, I invited him. So he came, and we had the biggest crowd, one of the biggest crowds we've ever had on the mall. And of course, they didn't want Chuck to leave. And Chuck said, the Smithsonian invited us. Let's hope they'll invite us again. So he asked everybody to leave peacefully. My question is, when I moved to D.C. in '82, I was born here, but I left very early. I came back, and I moved to 16th, 17th, and S Northwest. It was in the midst of gentrification then. And my aunt, my father's youngest sister, who had been one of the first Black policewomen in D.C., said, "You're moving where?" She said, "My gift to you is a locksmith, because that's near Murder Alley." And it's very hard for people to think of DuPont Circle pre-gentrification. Newcomers, I'm saying. So my question is, what were the neighborhoods before DuPont Circle that gentrified? What's the sequence?
Well, why don't we take these, and I haven't answered the last question if nobody else wants to touch it, but why don't we start with Natalie and we'll come down here.
Okay, so the question about code. So I looked a lot at the ABC board, the alcohol license, and so Jim Graham, that was his, one of the tools to get rid of go-go clubs and is by not giving them licenses. And that's a wealth of research too, because that's an ongoing situation with the ABC boards. And then on the strip clubs, I have to get your information where we go, because they shared the same spaces. So it was the same, and they overlap too. Like some of the promoters who did go-go clubs, they also did strip clubs. And, like the Legend, where I saw Chuck Brown perform, for the first time many years ago. That other nights, it was a strip club, So definitely the same spaces. And I think you're probably talking about Tracks, which is where, that was Go-Go Club. It was Chapter 3? That was before me, before I got to the city. But yeah, so it's Chapter 3. And that's where the baseball stadium is now. So yeah, all of that, it's all in the family. And and then mambo sauce is, that's great too. I mean, I had just a quick story about that. I had one of my son's soccer friends is from DC. We went out to Rockville, and he tried to order mambo sauce, and they were looking at him like, he just thinks that it's like everybody knows what mambo, like they think it's just ketchup, like this is what everybody has, mambo sauce, but uniquely DC thing as well. So, yeah.
To touch on the first with the code enforcement, I mean, I talked about the ANCs, their advisory neighborhood commissions, and, residents get elected to sit on those boards, and there are all these code enforcements that the city have, but, the cities never have enough resources to actually enforce all of the violations. But when you get these neighborhood groups that put pressure on the politicians and the city staff, that's when you get things to happen. And so the ANCs are voluntary and they're advisory, but they do these things called voluntary agreements with businesses coming in. And so they'll say, if you're going to play music, you better have it proofed and designed so that we don't hear the music outside. If you don't have that, we're going to advocate and tell the political leaders not to give you your liquor license. And they write up these contracts. So that is a way when I talked about how the ANCs are changing who's on them. And when the newcomers come on, they start putting in these voluntary agreements with various establishments, and they try to get out businesses that they don't want, like the go-go clubs. And they work with Jim Graham or other politicians in the city to make sure that those voluntary agreements are enforced. So yes, code enforcement is critical to understanding redevelopment and gentrification. And they, come about from different political dynamics that happen in the neighborhood. I can't speak much on the strip clubs. I have nothing really to say. Sounds interesting. I'll tag along too. Can I come along? If my wife will let me. But I wanted to touch on Brandy's point about there is something interesting happening in D.C. that these historic black neighborhoods, which are becoming less black, are utilizing black branding to bring in non-blacks to their neighborhood. Shaw U Street, right? It has been preserved historically. Its identity in terms of the building and the walking paths and everything is blackness, and yet the population is becoming less and less African American. So I think, though, in some ways, when a neighborhood was branded black, white flight happened, right? Now, all of a sudden, certain neighborhoods, when they're branded black, are cool and hip, and a whole cohort of young people of different races and ethnicities want to come. So something has changed fundamentally in the United States about understanding blackness. And yes, whites and others, loved black music, but didn't love black neighborhoods. But now, when neighborhood is branded black, if it's safe enough, people move in. And I think that that's somewhat of a positive change. It signifies a certain increase in racial tolerance and diversity and appreciation. Y'all may not agree with that, but I do think it's problematic that some of these neighborhoods that have been branded black, and I also interviewed some of the new white residents that say, I moved here because of the diversity. I want diversity. But then you watch their civic behaviors, and they're pushing out the diversity. But, it's an interesting tension and going on there. But you do see that on U Street, and you see that on H Street. And Brandy is doing work, or dissertation work is on the redevelopment of H Street and black identity. So that's something interesting. Blair's going to touch on, but neighborhood before DuPont Circle being gentrified. I think if we go back, Georgetown was probably right, the first one to be
maybe
gentrified.
I'll jump in here. We didn't know it was gentrification, but New Orleans, Charleston, D.C., as early as the 1930s, had the first kind of historic preservation drive in Georgetown, then Capitol Hill, Foggy Bottom. Jeff Henning wrote about Mount Pleasant, which seemed to be on the verge of gentrification, but didn't quite get there because it turned out the metro was going to be important. And then you see the march eastward, the line. Somebody talked about the whites had Georgetown and Connecticut Avenue. Then, and you were east of, I was west of Connecticut Avenue, you were east of Connecticut Avenue. Then suddenly it's 16th Street. Then it's 14th Street. Then it's 7th Street, and you see the march. But Georgetown is the first neighborhood to really go through this in the area, and it's the same story, but it's a different vocabulary because it happened so early. It was a working class, largely African American neighborhood with nice old houses that as early as the 1930s, in Charleston and the French Quarter, suddenly come into vogue. So I think it's important to understand this is not quite as new a process.
Just to add one neighbor, I mean, Old Town Alexandria, which used to be part of the district. I mean, people when they go to Old Town never think about it as, you know, it had declined and had a large percent of African Americans, and that is totally gentrified.
My grandfather was born in 1899 in South Carolina. He migrated to D.C. at the age of 17, and he went to Georgetown. His family was already there. They lived as an extended family unit, and that's where he lived until he got his own residence. And of course, C.R. Gibbs is the co-author of Black Georgetown Remembered, and that's also a documentary. Not the best documentary, but you know, and it gets to this issue of that there were communities that were predominantly African American. How did they get displaced? Some folks lived in alley dwellings. They got displaced through legislation that was designed to clean up the area, slum removal, etc. Not designed to help the people, not designed to provide them with better housing or job training or any sort of assistance in order to maintain their properties or purchase properties, etc., but designed to displace people. And so, and that indeed is what occurred. And Gibbs, you know, he's also, I used to have him come speak to my classes when I taught at American University. He would tell stories about his current residence and having to, what happens when an area is designated a historically significant area and the need to have to keep up with certain codes, et cetera. And for folks who cannot do that, for example, he had to replace brick in his home. Very costly. Not everybody can do that sort of thing. So that's another way in which people get displaced, through having to adhere to those kind of requirements. And then lastly, this thing about the use of blackness, which I think is very interesting. I think really what we're looking at to kind of reconcile this, what we see is people saying they want to come into a diverse area and then not acting like it. I think what we're witnessing is really kind of like the commodification of black culture, the consumption of black culture, which is not new, right? It's something that's very old, that goes back to, you know, really early periods in this country's history. You know, having the blackness without the people, if you will. That's also not new, right? People used to call this, in fact, there was a label for this very recently called swag jacking, and I believe that there was a discussion about that at Busboys and got very heated, and there's also a lot of pushback because some people are arguing, well, some of these places, Marvin's, I think we can name a number of different institutions, bars, clubs that are named after prominent black folks that were here in the city. The person that did some of the pushback argued that some of these places are co-owned by blacks, and I'm not sure the extent to which that's true, but, you know, I just think that's not a thing that's unusual for us.
Yeah, I have one comment about black branding, and then I want to wrap up because we're over time. It seems to me black branding, as I guess you figured out, is a really interesting story, and Derek is right, and we all know that there need not be anything pernicious about it. It is a way, and it is interesting that in American society, a place called Marvin's has a certain attractiveness to it. But I think we also have to be cognizant of the fact that it's very selective black branding. I haven't found the condominium called the Stokely yet. And when I find that condominium, I'll believe that there's something else going on. And finally, I just want to say house parties. If you spend time with older R&B and jazz musicians, they didn't need the internet to know where the house parties were. There were house parties all over D.C. It's where the real music happened. If you wanted to hear good music, you showed up at 2 in the morning, and the cab drivers all knew where to take you. You didn't need Facebook to find out. And this is another aspect of D.C. culture that is really important and hasn't gotten the attention that it deserves. we need to join the rest of our colleagues in the auditorium. So join me in thanking
you.
this wonderful
Thank you.
panel.
To many more panels I'm sure we'll all do together.
Thank you, Blair.
Thanks, well.
Great job.
The best moderator. I wonder who
Nice to meet you.
I have to return the favor and